Jax's revenge domain. The moment my manager said this department would move faster if someone more flexible were leading it, the room got real quiet. Not the polite kind of quiet, but the kind where you know something's already been decided behind your back. I was sitting halfway down the table, laptop closed, notes sitting there untouched. I'd learned a long time ago that when guys like Anthony Garcia start talking in code, they're not giving you feedback, they're setting you up. I'm Patrick Sullivan, by the way. 47 years old, been doing logistics for 22 years, and I can smell BS from a mile away. Anthony didn't even look at me when he said it. He was talking to the board. Flexibility matters now, he kept going, hands folded like he was being all reasonable. Patrick's approach has always been thorough, but the market's changing fast. There's that word again, thorough. Corporate speak for slow, old school, needs to go. A couple directors nodded along. One guy was scribbling notes on his agenda. Nobody asked about the numbers I'd fixed, the contracts I'd saved, or why we stopped having major screw-ups once I took over 3 years back. Anthony had this little smile going, not for me, but like he already knew how this was gonna end. I didn't jump in, didn't try to defend myself, didn't remind them that the whole system they loved bragging about last quarter only worked because I rebuilt it after Anthony's last flexible idea almost got us in trouble with compliance. I just listened when the chair lady cleared her throat and said, "We'll think about this and get back to you." That's when I knew for sure. I felt this calm come over me, because I already had a pretty good idea where this was headed. The resignation letter was in my bag, printed it up the night before. Not because I was panicking, but because I could see the writing on the wall. Anthony hadn't just been criticizing my work. He'd been working the board for weeks, slowly convincing them that keeping things stable was the same as being stuck in the past. He thought he was pushing me out. What he didn't get was that I'd already decided to step aside. When the meeting wrapped up, Anthony finally looked my way. His eyes had that look, like a guy who thinks he just won the lottery. I smiled right back, not because I was beaten, but because I knew what happens when people think staying quiet means giving up. And when you get rid of the one guy who actually knows how everything fits together. They always said I was careful, that I took my time, double-checked stuff other people were happy to rush through. Over the years, that word careful started meaning something different around the office. Conservative, old-fashioned, can't keep up. But none of these people were around the first time everything almost fell apart 3 years ago. When Transflow Logistics landed its biggest regional contract, the numbers looked great on paper. What nobody wanted to look at were all the moving parts underneath, the vendor, schedules that could go sideways, the compliance rules that would bite us if we cut corners, the way our old software talked to the new automated stuff. It was like building a house of cards in a wind tunnel. That was the week I stopped getting home before midnight. I went through every workflow, line by line, not to make them faster, but to make sure they wouldn't collapse when something went wrong. And things always go wrong. When a supplier missed their delivery window, we didn't crash and burn. When auditors showed up without warning, our paperwork was clean. When a system outage tried to take down 3 regions at once, it stopped with us. Anthony called it over-engineering. The board called it reliability. What they didn't understand was that reliability doesn't make noise. It doesn't show up in fancy presentations or flashy dashboards. When it's working, nobody notices. When it's gone, everybody remembers. Anthony never sat with me during those long weeks of fixing everything. He'd swing by my desk now and then, glance at my screen, and ask if I'd thought about streamlining things. When I explained why we couldn't skip a step without breaking some regulation, he'd nod and walk away. Then later, I'd see that exact step missing from some slide deck he sent upstairs. First time it happened, I figured it was just a mistake. Then it kept happening. Reports I wrote would come back with stuff changed, conclusions watered down, risks rewritten as temporary bumps in the road. My name was still at the bottom, but the meat of what I was saying got quietly edited. When I brought it up, Anthony would smile and say, "I just made it easier to digest." He never said easier for who. Around that same time, meetings started happening without me. Decisions I should have been part of showed up as announcements instead. When I asked why I wasn't included, Anthony would say, "We didn't want to bog you down." The irony wasn't lost on me. What really got to me wasn't being left out. It was the pattern I was seeing. The board was hearing a version of how we operated that sounded smoother than reality, cleaner, with less pushback, basically less me. The more Anthony talked about getting ready for the future, the more he made my work sound like something the company had already grown out of. That's when I started keeping my own files. Not to get back at anybody, just following my gut. Emails, version histories, who approved what, all the little changes that only someone paying attention would catch. I didn't know what I'd need them for yet. I just knew that when they start painting stability as weakness, somebody's about to push things too far. The first sign something was off was pretty small, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. A shipping variance that didn't match what the system logged, a delivery window that somehow got shorter without anyone saying why. By themselves, each little thing could be written off as normal growing pains, the kind of stuff that happens in any busy operation. But when you put them together, they started forming a picture I didn't like. I caught it during a routine review, the same kind I'd done hundreds of times before. Anthony's dashboard showed everything looking great. Better throughput, fewer delays, smoother handoffs between vendors. The numbers were impressive. Too impressive, actually. So I went and pulled the raw data afterward, expecting to confirm what he was showing. Instead, I found holes. Timestamps that didn't line up with how processes actually worked, completion markers that skipped over required checkpoints, safety buffers that had been quietly removed and replaced with wishful thinking. It wasn't a mess. It was edited. Someone had decided which parts of the truth were useful. I flagged the first issue privately, sent Anthony a quick email. He got back to me within minutes, all cheerful and reassuring. We're testing out a more agile approach. Early numbers always look a little messy. Messy wasn't the word I'd use. A week later, same pattern showed up in a different region, different team, same missing pieces. When I checked the change logs, all the approvals traced back to Anthony's login. I didn't confront him right away. Instead, I started running my own checks, cross-referencing everything against the original contract terms I'd negotiated years back. That's when I realized we had a real problem. One of our biggest clients operates under federal oversight. Any major change to how we handle their stuff requires disclosure, documentation, approval, the whole 9 yards. The steps Anthony had cut weren't just cosmetic. They were there to protect us. Without them, we were wide open. I documented everything, screenshots, version comparisons, email trails, kept copies on my personal drive, not because I didn't trust our internal systems, but because I'd seen how fast the truth can get rewritten once it hits a boardroom full of people who've already made up their minds. At the next leadership meeting, Anthony presented his updated numbers with a big smile on his face. "We've cut cycle time by nearly 20%, he announced. "This is what happens when you stop holding on to outdated restrictions." A few board members nodded along. I kept it simple. Those restrictions are tied to client compliance. We can't just remove them without proper disclosure. Anthony's smile didn't budge. "We're not removing anything. We're optimizing." The room bought that answer way too easily. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about bad data or sloppy processes. Once people believe a story about progress, they stop asking what it's really costing. After the meeting, I sat in my office longer than usual. The building was winding down for the day, people heading home, totally unaware that we were about to step over a line we couldn't easily step back from. Anthony wasn't being reckless. He was being confident. And confidence, when it runs over good sense, has a way of bringing down everything from the inside, slowly at first, then all at once. The meeting invite showed up without any context. No agenda, no prep materials, just a calendar block labeled Operational Alignment Review and a list of names that told me everything I needed to know. 2 board members who rarely showed up for mid-quarter sessions, plus legal and finance. Oh, and Anthony. I didn't scramble to put together slides or practice my talking points. I just reviewed the timeline of everything that had been happening. The night before the big meeting, I spread everything out on my dining room table. Printed contracts, marked up workflows, my own notes tracking when safeguards got removed and who did it. I wasn't planning to present any of it. I just needed to see the whole picture laid out in front of me. It wasn't sloppy work or honest mistakes. It was a story being built piece by piece, carefully. By the time I closed everything up, I'd already written my resignation letter. Not because I thought I'd lose, but because I wasn't going to waste time trying to explain reality to people who'd already decided it was inconvenient. The boardroom felt different the next morning. Chairs pulled in tighter than usual, no small talk before we got started. Anthony sat closer to the head of the table, relaxed and attentive like he'd rehearsed this whole thing. I took my usual seat and waited. The chair opened with a summary of operational concerns. A bunch of vague, corporate speak floated around the table. Pace misalignment, strategic friction, resistance to modernization. Nobody mentioned specific numbers. Nobody brought up actual contracts. Then Anthony took his turn. He was smooth about it, gave me credit for past work, acknowledged that I'd kept things stable during the rough patches, and then, with just the right amount of professional sympathy, suggested that the company had grown beyond what my leadership style could handle. I listened without jumping in. When the chair finally asked if I had anything to say, the whole room leaned forward a little. They were expecting me to defend myself, negotiate, promise to change. I didn't give them any of that. "I understand where you want to take things," I said, keeping it calm and simple. "And I'm not going to stand in your way." I reached into my bag and put the resignation letter on the table. The quiet that followed was different than before. Anthony blinked once. Just once. "I think this works out best for everyone," I continued, effective immediately. The chair hesitated for a second, then nodded. They accepted it faster than they looked surprised, like this was just checking off the last box on a list they'd already made. Nobody stopped me when the meeting ended. Nobody asked questions. Anthony caught my eye near the door. His smile was polite, controlled, satisfied. He thought I'd given up. What he didn't realize was that by stepping aside, I'd just removed the last thing, standing between his story and the systems that couldn't actually support it. And stories, no matter how good they sound, fall apart when they have to carry real weight. My first week away from TransFlow was weird. Too quiet. No urgent texts, no late-night alerts, no red warning lights flashing on my phone. For the first time in years, my cell just sat there on the kitchen counter while I had my morning coffee and actually read the news. At first, I wondered if maybe I'd been wrong about everything. Maybe Anthony really had smoothed things over. Maybe the systems I'd built were solid enough to run without me. Maybe I'd overestimated how much the place actually needed me around. Then the calls started coming in. Not to me directly, but to people who still had my number. A former analyst texted asking where some backup file was stored. A vendor I'd worked with for years reached out, confused about a new process request that didn't match our usual agreement. A compliance guy sent clients what looked like a routine inquiry about a timeline that didn't add up. None of them sounded panicked. But they all had the same thing in common. They were following instructions that didn't quite make sense, and they weren't sure who to ask about it anymore. Anthony had stepped right into my spot, no hesitation. From what I heard, he was running meetings, reassuring partners, talking confidently about optimization strategies. On the surface, everything was moving faster, fewer approvals needed, decisions getting made without all the back and forth. Speed at last. But speed costs you something when you're moving too fast to see where you're going. I watched from the outside, not because I was hiding, but because when you step back far enough, patterns become obvious that you miss when you're in the middle of things. Without me there to catch problems before they became bigger problems, the system started doing exactly what it was designed to do, rejecting shortcuts it couldn't verify. A delayed shipment here, a billing mismatch there, small stuff, explainable stuff, until it wasn't small anymore. By week 2, a supplier put a hold on fulfillment until they got clarity on liability coverage. By week 3, a client asked for a formal review of recent process changes. The tone stayed professional, but the questions got sharper. Anthony's name was showing up in more email threads, and his replies were getting longer. I didn't step in, didn't offer to help, not because I wanted to see him struggle, but because I'd learned something important over the years. Systems don't punish ambition, they punish cutting corners. One afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. "Patrick, this is Anthony. Just wanted to check in with you. The team's running into a few contextual questions they're having trouble answering." His voice sounded steady, but you could hear the strain underneath. Questions have a way of becoming less optional when you keep ignoring them. I deleted the message and went back to reading. That night, I dug out a notebook I hadn't opened since leaving, the same records I'd been keeping quietly for months. Not as ammunition, just as backup memory. That's when I understood what was really happening. My leaving hadn't broken anything. It had just pulled back the curtain on the difference between looking stable and actually being stable. Once that illusion cracks, no amount of confident explanations can patch it back together. By the time the board realized something was seriously wrong, the damage had moved past theoretical. You could see it in how people talked. Emails stopped using words like optimization and efficiency and started focusing on clarification and temporary delays. Meetings multiplied. Legal started showing up in rooms where they usually weren't needed unless something had already gone sideways. Anthony kept talking with that same confidence he always had, but confidence starts sounding like excuse-making when you have to use it too often. A regional client asked for written confirmation that recent workflow changes matched the original agreement. Anthony assured them everything was fine. Legal asked for documentation. There was a delay. A supplier flagged a revised delivery instruction as contradicting liability terms. Anthony blamed it on miscommunication. Finance wanted to know who authorized the change. Each question came in politely. Each answer took longer to provide. What they couldn't see yet was that Anthony was now reacting to the system instead of controlling it. He was chasing problems instead of preventing them, and systems don't respond well to being chased. I heard about the emergency board session through a former colleague who still trusted me enough to give me a heads up. The board had called for a full operational reconciliation, current processes against original contract baselines. That's never a good sign when it happens. Those baselines were mine. Anthony could show them revised charts, smoother graphs, optimistic projections. But reconciliation doesn't care about presentation. It only asks one question. Does this match what was actually agreed to? The answer was going to be no. A week later, another voicemail. Patrick, it's Anthony again. Look, I know things didn't wrap up smoothly between us, but your institutional knowledge could really help us out right now. Even just a quick conversation would be huge. This time, the strain wasn't hidden at all. I didn't call back. Not because I wanted him to fail, but because this was exactly when he needed to understand the difference between knowing how to talk about something and actually knowing how it works. You can't outsource accountability after the fact. From what I learned later, the board's patience ran out pretty quickly. Questions shifted from what happened to who approved this. Timelines got scrutinized, access logs got pulled. Anthony's name kept appearing, not as an innovator, but as a bottleneck. The irony was perfect. He'd painted my work as resistance to progress. Now, without that resistance, progress had accelerated straight into a wall. The board wasn't calling it a failure yet. They were calling it a governance issue. And governance issues don't get fixed with enthusiasm or smooth talking. They get fixed with documentation, responsibility, and consequences. By the time Anthony realized what was happening, the story he'd told about me, about being overly cautious, about slowing things down, about getting in the way, was getting told in reverse. And this time, I wasn't standing in the room having to defend it. The audit didn't show up with sirens and flashing lights. No dramatic announcements or emergency emails to the whole company. Just a request. Formal, polite, unavoidable, for documentation that already existed somewhere Anthony couldn't go back and edit. Auditors have their own style. They're calm, methodical, and they don't care about anyone's story. They just want to see the paperwork. The board called it routine governance. Just a reconciliation, they said, standard precaution. But precautions only happen after confidence has taken a beating. The first thing the auditors wanted were the original operational baselines tied to our biggest contracts, not the updated versions, not the summary reports, the originals. I knew exactly which documents they were talking about when a former colleague described the list to me over a careful phone conversation. Version numbers, dependency maps, compliance clauses that required explicit approval before any material changes. Those were my documents, my work, my signature on the approvals. Anthony tried to stay ahead of it. He sent clarifying memos. He offered to walk the auditors through the reasoning behind the optimization strategy. He volunteered context and background. They listened politely. Then they asked for approvals. That's where everything changed. Approvals either exist or they don't. There's no middle ground, no room for interpretation. When they pulled the access logs, a clear pattern emerged that no amount of smooth talking could explain away. Changes initiated under Anthony's login. Reviews skipped, sign-offs assumed but never actually granted. He wasn't being accused of anything, he was being documented. The board's whole attitude shifted. Meetings that used to feel collaborative became investigative. Legal stopped asking if and started asking when. Finance stopped planning ahead and started locking down discretionary spending. Anthony, who used to be at the center of every decision, suddenly found himself asked to wait outside rooms he used to run. I found out about all this secondhand through careful conversations with people who chose their words like the walls might be listening. Through the obvious shift in how my name was being mentioned, not as a problem anymore, but as a reference point. One board member apparently asked a simple question that cut through weeks of deflection. If Patrick Sullivan designed the original structure, why was he removed before these changes were implemented? Nobody had a good answer for that, because the real answer wasn't flattering to anyone. By the end of that week, Anthony's authority was quietly limited to day-to-day operations only. No strategic changes, no new initiatives, no unsupervised modifications. He still had his title, but titles don't mean much when you can't actually use them. Authority is fragile that way. I was sitting at home one evening going through notes I hadn't needed to look at in weeks, when my phone buzzed with a message from someone I hadn't heard from in months. One of the board members. Short and professional. We underestimated the implications of your departure. I read it twice. It wasn't an apology. It was acknowledgement. An acknowledgement, when it comes this late, carries weight. The outcome didn't get announced with press releases or company-wide emails. It happened in stages. Careful, procedural, final. First came the internal memo about revised governance policies. Then the quiet reassignment of responsibilities that made it clear Anthony Garcia was no longer calling the shots. The board started rebuilding the exact same structures they'd let him tear down. Risk buffers got put back in place. Approval chains were reinstated. External partners were notified, formally and transparently, about changes that should never have been hidden in the first place. And in those conversations, my name kept coming up. Not as a comparison or a defense, but as a blueprint. Return to the Sullivan framework. Cross-check against Patrick's original dependencies. Make sure this aligns with the safeguards Patrick built. I learned about all this slowly, through careful messages and quiet confirmations. Nobody asked me to come back. Nobody offered to reverse what had happened. They didn't need to. The company wasn't looking for leadership anymore. It was looking for stability. Anthony's final review wrapped up without fanfare. The findings cited governance failures and unauthorized process modifications. Responsibility was assigned without drama. His departure was labeled a mutual decision. Mutual is what organizations call it when they want an ending without having to explain themselves. What hit me most wasn't watching him fall, but how fast the whole narrative flipped. The same people who used to call my work resistant to change now described it as foundational. The same caution they'd dismissed as old-fashioned was suddenly forward-thinking risk management. Not because they felt bad about what happened, but because they needed it to be true. One evening, a former director reached out privately, not to apologize exactly, but to say something that felt like regret. "We didn't realize how much of the system relied on your judgment," she wrote. "We confused confidence with competence." I didn't write back. Some realizations don't need witnesses. The company got stable again, slowly and carefully, exactly the way it always did when process was allowed to work properly. Anthony became a case study in quarterly reviews, a lesson quietly built into governance training. And me? I wasn't angry. I wasn't triumphant. I was free from needing to be understood by people who only listen when consequences force them to. I didn't go back. Not to the building, not to the role they quietly redefined after I left. By the time they finished fixing what had been broken, they didn't need to ask me to return. The system was running on its own again, slower maybe, but honest, predictable, based on reality instead of wishful thinking. Just like it was designed to be. What stayed with me wasn't the vindication or the late recognition, it was the clarity that came after. Understanding that doing things right often looks unimpressive until the moment shortcuts come due. I didn't laugh when they fired me. I laughed because I knew I wouldn't have to prove anything anymore. Since then, I've picked my spots carefully, not based on titles or urgency, but on whether people value getting it right over getting it done fast. Systems don't reward ego, they reward care. And karma doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It just lets truth carry its own weight until whatever was built on shaky ground can't stand anymore. When that happens, you don't need to push. You just step aside and let gravity handle the rest.